Welcome to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This is the lesson on planning communications management, Part 2. And now we move on to the one and only communications management planning process, Plan Communications Management, and its primary output, the Communications Management Plan. This plan defines the collection, creation, dissemination, storage, retrieval, management, tracking, and disposition of communications artifacts. Notice that this is quite a list. It's not just about sending out information and keeping an eye on it. It's about collecting information, creating communications, and disseminating those. And then how do you store your communications after they've gone out? How do you retrieve them later if you need to revisit them? How do you manage all of your communications? How do you track them to see, for example, who has seen what and what's been done with them? And then how do you dispose of them in the end? In certain environments, communications need to follow a retention schedule and after a certain period of time need to be disposed of. The Planned Communications Management process has as its inputs the Stakeholder Engagement Plan, the Stakeholder Register, the Resource Management Plan, your requirements documentation, as well as some enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets. Stakeholder engagement and communications are very closely related. And so it's no surprise that the strategies that you've identified for engaging your stakeholders will include a lot of communications requirements that you need to include in your communications management plan. Your stakeholder register has specific information about individual stakeholders and the activities regarding communications that you've planned for those stakeholders, and these need to be included in your communications management plan. Your resource management plan can also identify specific communication requirements for specific resources. And your requirements documentation could have specific requirements for communication for specific requirements. You may have specific project requirements that require specific types of communication with certain stakeholders, or certain stakeholders may need to be kept aware of progress on these requirements or consulted more on these requirements. All of this sort of information about requirements needs to be captured in your communications management plan. The enterprise environmental factors that can influence your communications management plan include your organizational culture, political climate, and governance. This is an item that you've seen a lot before, as well as personnel administration policies, which can tell you and give you guidelines on how you should be communicating with different people. Your stakeholder risk thresholds will be important to consider in your communications, as you'll need to keep a close eye on your risks and communicate your project risks relative to these risk thresholds to the appropriate stakeholders. You'll also want to take advantage of your organization's established communication channels, tools, and systems that you have available to you and with which your key stakeholders are already familiar. You'll also want to be considerate of and sensitive to the global, regional, or local trends, practices, and habits when it comes to communication, particularly as they apply to your organization. And the geographic distribution of your facilities, resources, and personnel can dramatically affect how you need to communicate with these remote or geographically dispersed people and facilities. And here are some of the organizational process assets that can influence your project. You may want to use social media and other public communications, and so you'll need to be aware of your organization's policies and procedure for these kinds of communications, including ethics and security, such as information security regarding what you can and can't share. Also, your organization's policies and procedures for how you manage and communicate regarding issues, risks, and change and data management. Your organization may also already have specific communication requirements in general that you need to follow, and it will be very helpful to you if you can find already existing guidelines for how information and communication should be developed, exchanged, stored, retrieved, disposed of, and so on. As always, you can learn more about stakeholder engagement and communications from historical information from previous projects in your Lessons Learned repository. And now we move on to the tools and techniques of the planned communications management process. At the top of the list, as usual, is expert judgment. Who can you consult with to learn the policies and procedures that may affect your project? To learn about those policies and procedures that your organization has that are applicable to you. Who can tell you about the communications technologies and practices of your organization? Would it be the PMO, your program or portfolio, your project sponsor, other project managers? Who in your organization has had experience working with some of these same stakeholders, customers, or project sponsors that can tell you more about what their communication needs are? Even an industry expert could help you understand the terminology and the types of communications that are typical and expected in that industry. Also, you have to consider change management. And then you have organizational change management, which, as you recall, is different from project change management. Organizational change management is about how to manage changes within your organization. Ask yourself, who in your organization has had experience with any organizational change management initiatives that have happened and could give you some advice on the types of communications that were effective in those kinds of changes. These could be helpful for you, not only in understanding the context in which your project operates, the changes people have had to go through and how that affects their needs, but also in how you will manage change to your organization as a result of your project. Next, we have communication requirements analysis, which is the process of figuring out what the information needs are of your various stakeholders. For this requirements analysis, there are a number of inputs, some of which are listed here. At the top of the list, you have a need to gather information about your stakeholders and their communication requirements, which you can get from your stakeholder register and stakeholder engagement plan. You'll also want to consider the number of communication channels or paths that you have between stakeholders and how you can manage those to minimize the number of paths of communication so that you can have more control over this communication and to ensure that it is accurate and timely. Consulting your organization's org charts, as well as your own project's organization, can help you see how information needs to flow and the different requirements of your different stakeholders depending on where they are within the organization. Your development approach can also have a significant impact on your communications planning, particularly if you're running an agile project, which has very different communications, especially compared to your traditional predictive approach. With an agile approach, you favor much more face-to-face communication and co-location rather than a lot of written communication. Next, we have locations, disciplines, and specialties. Where people are located will derive a lot of their communication requirements. Working with remote team members or virtual teams involves much different communication and much more attention to making sure that they're in the loop and that they feel a part of the team. The different disciplines or specialties of your different team members can affect your communication needs as well. Then make sure you're taking into consideration both internal and external information needs. It's very common in a project to focus a little too much on the internal communication needs at the expense of the external needs, and to forget that there are some people outside of your project team that may need some communication from you on a more regular basis and to be kept informed and in the loop. And then there are legal requirements as you consider your communication requirements. You'll have certain restrictions on what can be shared with whom and when. Next in our list of tools and techniques for planned communications management is communication technology. Various methods exist, from conversations, meetings, documents, databases, social media, websites, and even some of the more modern collaboration tools that have come about specifically to address the needs for communications between team members and key stakeholders on a project or within an entire organization. Which of these methods you should use for which types of communications and when depends on a number of factors, some of which are listed here, such as the urgency of the communication, the frequency with which it needs to go out, the format of the information that needs to be presented, the availability and reliability of the technology, its ease of use, the environment in which your project operates, including its locations, the languages of the different stakeholders, and the cultures involved. Also, the sensitivity and confidentiality of information and communications. For example, you may find that certain stakeholders don't usually get the message when it's something urgent. They don't get it soon enough anyway. And so, rather than sending them a message or an email, you need to pick up the phone and give them a call, or go down to their office and meet with them face to face. Other stakeholders are working closely with their messaging system or collaborative tools, and you can send them a message and get a very quick response that way. It all depends on the message and the recipient as to which type of communication technology you use for which type of message. Next, we come to two different types of communication models. The first is the basic sender-receiver model, and the second is the interactive model. The first basic sender-receiver model has as its basic steps the encoding of a message, the transmission of it, and then the decoding of it. The interactive model takes this one step further, involves not only encoding, transmitting, and decoding, but also an acknowledgement that the message was received and some feedback or response to the message. In either of these communication models, the sender's responsibility is to be clear and complete and to confirm that the message was correctly interpreted. The receiver's responsibility is to make sure that the message is received in its entirety, that it's interpreted correctly, and that you acknowledge or respond to that message if it's an interactive message that calls for acknowledgement or response. These communication models also include the concept of noise. Noise is defined as anything that interferes with communication. It could be things such as the technology causing noise, the procedures that you follow, the language and culture, any distractions on the part of the sender or the receiver that can affect the communication, the perceptions of sender or receiver that affect how you interpret the information, as well as a lack of knowledge or trust of each other. Other noise factors include technology, procedures, language, and culture, but also age, nationality, ethnicity, race, and gender, your working methods or professional discipline, the distraction in your environment, your different perceptions, your lack of knowledge or trust. Even your emotional state, or your background or personality or individual biases, these are all things that can affect the message and are categorized as noise. Here's a simple diagram of the communications model. On the left, you see the sender, and on the right, the receiver. On the left, the first thing that happens is you encode the message. This could be as complex as typing your message into an email and having that translated into all of the bits and signals and so on to transmit the message. But encoding also applies to the simple process of translating your thoughts into words when you're speaking with someone. Then in that communication, there can be noise caused by all these different factors. And then the decoding on the recipient's end is the process of taking that information, converting it back into thoughts and understanding. If the message is received, there can be an acknowledgement that the message was received. This doesn't include understanding or any communication that indicates that the message was understood, just that it was received. And this can also have noise on the line. And then the receiver could provide feedback or a response of some kind, which also needs to be encoded in some way, transmitted, and then decoded on the sender's end. I'd also like to add a note about the difference between direct and indirect communication. Direct communication, such as you'll find in the United States, is when the words are what matter most. Indirect communication, such as you'll find in Asia, is when the words matter less than other factors, such as how the message was communicated, by whom, when it was communicated, what the body language was during the communication, the timing of it. It's essential for you and your team members to be aware of the differences between direct and indirect communication styles. All too often, when you have a direct person and an indirect person communicating, the indirect person will assign importance that wasn't intended to all sorts of indirect factors in the communication. And the direct person will think that they understand the indirect person, but may actually get the wrong message, because the direct person is oblivious to all of the indirect factors that are being used to communicate, sometimes to communicate a message which is the complete opposite of the words being used. You should also learn as much as you can about the various cultures that you're working with and how they operate differently in a business context. For example, in some cultures, meetings are started by getting right to the point. In other cultures, it's more customary to start off with some small talk and to talk about all sorts of different things, about personal things and family and getting to know each other before you get to the point of the meeting. If you mix these two cultures, this can create some conflict if you're not aware of these differences. If you're working in a culture that normally starts with some small talk, you need to accommodate that and participate in that small talk rather than feeling anxious about getting to the point right away. You should also be aware of cultural differences in how relationships are established and mature. A friend of mine once described this as the difference between a peach and a coconut, saying that people from the United States are more like peaches. They're friendly and warm and fuzzy, and you can bite into this relationship right away. But there's a core, a seed at the center that you're probably never going to get into. Whereas lots of other cultures, like the one my friend was from, is more like a coconut. It can be very difficult to establish any sort of relationship with other people. But like a coconut, once you get past that hard outer shell, you're able to establish a relationship in which everything is shared, which is very different from the peach. Next we have interactive versus push versus pull types of communication methods. Interactive communications are things like meetings and phone calls, texting, video conferencing, in which you have a small number of participants and they're able to interact highly with each other. Push communications are things that you send out and don't expect or usually get much of a feedback or response loop on. These are things like letters, reports, and emails, also voicemails, blogs, and press releases. These are communications that are one way. Pull communications are things like web portals and intranets and e-learning, lessons learned databases, and knowledge repositories, things that contain lots of useful information, but they're not pushed to you. You have to go out there and consult them yourself and pull this information to you. Pull communications are useful and have an advantage in working with large audiences or with large complex information. Also in our list of tools and techniques, we have interpersonal and team skills, which you'll need to apply in assessing the different communication styles that you should use and being aware of the politics in your organization, including both your formal and informal power relationships, relationships that are based on the org chart that are more formal, and informal ones that are based on relationships that people have across these organizational boundaries. And as mentioned before, you'll need to have a lot of cultural awareness and sensitivity in order to communicate effectively. Finally, we have a data representation category that includes things like the stakeholder engagement matrix, which can be used to assess and identify the gaps between the current and desired level of engagement that you'd like to have with your stakeholders. Plus, of course, all sorts of meetings that you can have to come up with your communications management plan. Let's review the inputs, outputs, tools, and techniques of plan communications management. The main output is the communications management plan, but as you're developing this plan, you may have updates that you need to apply, particularly to your stakeholder engagement plan and stakeholder register, and perhaps even to your project schedule and other project documents or project management subsidiary plans. Your inputs include your project charter, of course, and different components such as your stakeholder engagement plan and stakeholder register, and your resource management plan and requirements documentation, as well as a host of different factors that can influence your planning, considering all of the policies and procedures and tools and other resources available to you through enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets. Tools and techniques include expert judgment, of course, communications requirements analysis, and consideration of the communication technology that's available to you, communication models you could use, communication methods, interpersonal and team skills will be useful, as well as different sorts of data representation, and, of course, all sorts of meetings. In this lesson, we've covered some of the basics of communication, that it is the exchange of information with the purpose of engaging stakeholders and building those relationships. We've covered different factors such as written, spoken, formal, informal, official, and unofficial communication and the directions of communication. The formula for calculating the number of channels of communication, active listening, awareness, setting expectations, persuasion, motivation, coaching, negotiation, and conflict resolution skills. The basic communication models, the sender and receiver responsibilities, and the noise that can interfere with communication. Direct versus indirect communications, and reviewed the inputs, outputs, tools, and techniques of communications planning. For more information, you can refer to these pages of the PMBOK guide. PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.